Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why that specific car felt so necessary, even when you knew it didn't really match your salary? It's not a comfortable question, and that's exactly where most people choose not to look, because the problem isn't buying an expensive car. The problem is the invisible reason you felt you needed it in the first place, and almost no one has the courage to face that head on. There's something that doesn't show up in the contract, doesn't come in the monthly payments, and isn't written anywhere, but it weighs more than the amount you pay each month. The silence that car buys. The silence from questions, from looks, from comparisons. The brief relief of not having to explain your financial life, of looking like everything's fine, of projecting an image of success that works perfectly on a feed. That feels normal, but it isn't. And this is where the game starts to change. Maybe you've never thought about it this way, but a car is often not a rational, personal finance decision. It's an emotional response. A quick way to align your real life with a financial life that only exists on Instagram. While everyone else is posting trips, milestones, and apparently prosperous routines, the car becomes a kind of visual translation of "I made it too," even when, deep down, the numbers don't add up. Even when your paycheck barely keeps pace. Almost no one notices this, but the car isn't really there to get you from one place to another. It's there to protect you from a feeling. The feeling of falling behind, the feeling of not being taken seriously, the feeling that you need to prove something, even if you're not sure to whom. Have you felt that? That strange sense of calm right after the purchase, as if something had finally been settled, even though you know nothing truly changed. In behavioral financial psychology, this is more common than it seems. Automotive status works like an emotional shock absorber. It doesn't improve your financial life, but it reduces social discomfort for a while. The problem is that this while is expensive. Months, sometimes years, of invisible pressure, stalled decisions, postponed choices. And what's most striking is that from the outside, no one notices. The feed still looks good. The image still works. What you're about to realize might surprise you, because this trap isn't born from a desire for luxury, but from the fear of looking inadequate. The car becomes a quiet way of saying, "I'm on the same level," even when your financial reality tells a different story. And that's exactly why this kind of choice is so hard to question. It doesn't feel wrong, it feels necessary. If this sounds familiar, stay with me. Because before we talk about payments, interest, or planning, there's a much more uncomfortable question that needs to be asked. A question almost no one asks at the moment of purchase, but one that completely changes how you see your own money. What is this car really trying to hide? And maybe, as you're listening to this, a memory starts to take shape. A specific moment, a conversation, a passing thought that crossed your mind right before the decision. Because when we look at it honestly, we realize it was almost never just about mobility, comfort, or personal taste. It was about fitting in, about not standing out, about not being the one who shows up somewhere and feels like they owe a silent explanation. That feels normal, but it isn't. And almost. No one talks about it out loud. A lot of people live with this same tension but carry it alone, thinking it's a personal flaw, when in reality, it's a collective pattern. If at any point you recognized yourself here, it's worth saying this. Sometimes writing in the comments about what hit you the hardest or where you saw yourself isn't just venting. It's a way of realizing you're not isolated in this experience. When someone reads it and thinks, "This happens to me too," the conversation stops being lonely and starts becoming a community. And if this reflection is making sense right now, a simple like helps more than it seems. It signals that this kind of topic needs to circulate more, to reach people who are also stuck in this quiet logic of appearances and social pressure. That's how these conversations stay alive, instead of being swallowed by content that only reinforces the same pattern. If you feel drawn to keep looking at money from this more honest, psychological, human angle, subscribing to the channel is almost a natural extension of this dialogue, not to promise quick fixes, but to follow reflections that usually stay off the feed, outside of surface-level conversations. The idea here is to keep uncovering these invisible layers one by one at the pace real understanding requires. Because from here on, once you start paying closer attention, it becomes impossible not to notice how certain choices that feel individual are actually automatic responses to an entire environment. And it's exactly at this point that the story starts to get even more interesting. And when you start paying closer attention, you realize that the decision rarely comes out of nowhere. It usually comes after hours of scrolling, silent comparisons, and small hits to the ego that almost no one admits feeling. The feed slowly turns into an environment, not just a place for distraction. And like any environment, it shapes behavior. Gradually, without warning, it redefines what feels acceptable, normal, expected. Your actual salary stays the same, but the reference point shifts, and that completely changes how financial decisions are made. Because in practice, very few people sit down and say, "This car fits my income, my planning, my journey." What happens is much subtler. You see co-workers showing up with better models, friends posting constant wins, influencers living a routine that always seems to be expanding. And without realizing it, the brain creates a new benchmark, a kind of shared imaginary salary. Not what you earn, but what it looks like everyone else earns. That feels normal, but it isn't. And almost no one notices the exact moment that switch happens. The hidden truth is that the feed doesn't show the behind the scenes. It doesn't show payments, renegotiations, end-of-month anxiety, or the choices that were postponed just to keep an image intact. It shows outcomes, never impact. And when you use that edited snapshot as your measuring stick, every choice starts carrying more emotional weight than it should. The car stops being a means and becomes an answer, an attempt to align your real life with a version of reality that doesn't fully exist. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because the most delicate point isn't the comparison itself, but who you think you're competing with. It's not real people, with contradictions, limits, and different contexts. It's carefully assembled versions, filtered, curated, selected. You're not competing with someone made of flesh and bone. You're competing with a narrative, and narratives don't feel the consequences of decisions. You do. When this settles in, your mindset shifts without you noticing. Decisions that once felt risky start to feel justifiable. The discomfort of spending beyond your plan is numbed by a sense of belonging. On the outside, everything looks coherent. On the inside, a quiet tension begins to grow. Your financial journey stops being built at a sustainable pace and starts being pushed by the fear of looking stuck. And that's where many people lose their footing, not because of ignorance, but because of overstimulation. This kind of realization is uncomfortable because it pulls the problem out of the space of individual blame and places it in the environment. It's not a lack of discipline or a lack of desire to do better. It's constant exposure to a distorted reality that makes misaligned choices feel natural. Once you understand this, something shifts. You start seeing the car, consumption, and even money itself through a different lens, not as isolated symbols, but as responses to a context that applies pressure all the time. And as this awareness starts to form, new questions emerge, harder to ignore, about how much of your decisions truly came from you, and how much came from this constant visual noise. If this part of the conversation stirred something inside you, comment below. This makes sense to me, and it's exactly when. This silent comparison has already shaped your mindset that the bill starts to show up. Not on the day of the purchase, not in the photo with the new car, not in that first moment when everything feels under control. The real cost appears later, diluted, hidden in everyday life. Because what no one posts isn't the full price. It's the monthly cost of appearances. That payment that seems small on its own, but when added to all the other choices, starts taking up far too much space in your life. At first, you even try to treat it as normal. You adjust one expense here, postpone another there, tell yourself it's just a phase. That sounds reasonable, but it isn't. Little by little, your decisions get tighter. An invitation you turn down, a plan you put off, an opportunity you ignore because now's not the time. And almost without noticing, the car that was supposed to expand your possibilities starts to shrink your options. Not out of bad intent, but because of poorly calculated emotional math. The invisible domino effect is quiet precisely because it doesn't come from a major crisis. It comes from the accumulation of small concessions. A fixed payment creates rigidity. Rigidity creates fear of making mistakes. Fear of mistakes freezes movement. And when you finally realize it, it's no longer you deciding how much life you can afford that month. The commitment is deciding for you. The car feels like freedom until the day it defines the limit of your journey. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because the impact isn't just financial, it's psychological. There's a very specific kind of anxiety that shows up at the end of every month, even when nothing is technically wrong. That feeling that any unexpected expense becomes a threat, that any change requires excessive calculation, that backing out isn't an option because backing out would mean admitting something you don't want to face. The car stops being an asset and becomes an emotional contract with the image you're maintaining. And the most delicate part is that from the outside, no one sees this weight. The feed stays intact. The narrative keeps working. Only you know the behind-the-scenes reality, the internal negotiations, the constant mental effort to keep everything standing. This is where the hidden truth starts to surface. The symbol of success isn't pushing you forward, it's holding you in place. It doesn't speed up transformation, it freezes it. A lot of people recognize themselves here because this rigidity doesn't come from irresponsibility, but from a genuine desire to belong. But the impact goes beyond money. It shapes future decisions, influences career choices, affects how you see risk and opportunity. Your financial journey becomes defensive, not constructive, and that comes at a cost that never shows up on a bank statement. When this awareness starts to clear, a new kind of discomfort appears, uncomfortable but necessary. The question stops being, how do I pay for this? And becomes, what is this preventing me from living? And that question, when asked honestly, opens an important crack in the logic of appearances. If this part of the conversation touched something inside you, comment below. I'm on this journey too. And this is where one of the most protected beliefs starts to crack. There's a quiet, almost automatic idea that looking successful opens doors, creates opportunities, makes paths easier, as if the right image worked like a social shortcut. But when you look at it more coldly, you realize that financially the opposite happens. Status doesn't expand your margin for error. It shrinks it. It doesn't give you freedom. It demands constant maintenance. When you look too put together, you can't slip. You can't pull back. You can't say, this month was tough. You can't slow down without raising eyebrows. Every decision starts carrying the weight of staying consistent with the image you've built. And that's suffocating, because real life doesn't move in a straight line, but appearances demand consistency. They demand that everything keeps looking under control, even when it isn't. That's the paradox of status. The more you impress, the less room you have to be honest with yourself. Admitting financial strain becomes a threat. Lowering your standard of living turns into symbolic failure. And little by little, your mindset shifts. You start making decisions not based on their real impact on your journey, but on what they communicate. Money stops being a tool for transformation and becomes a tool for maintaining a narrative. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because this prison isn't visible, but it's incredibly effective. When you're maintaining an image, you can't choose slower paths even if they're more solid. You can't accept smaller gains temporarily. You can't invest in something that doesn't show results right away. Everything has to deliver fast, visible returns, and that kills long-term strategies before they even have a chance to begin. There's a hidden truth here that almost no one likes to face. Status doesn't just cost money, it costs choices. It costs opportunities you turn down, risks you avoid, decisions you postpone. It creates a financially rigid life where any move off script feels too dangerous. And the most ironic part is that, from the outside, this still looks like success. Only the person inside feels the weight. At this point, the car stops being just an expensive asset. It becomes a symbol of that social cage, a constant reminder that you have to keep performing. The car that impresses today is the same one that blocks your turning point tomorrow. Not because the car is the villain, but because it demands consistency with a version of you that may no longer make sense for where you want to go. When this realization starts to sink in, something shifts in how you see status, progress, and even success. The question stops being, what does this show? And becomes, what does this allow me to do? And that shift in perspective is uncomfortable, because it dismantles a lot of things that once felt certain, but it's also freeing, because it opens space for decisions that are aligned with reality, not with the display window. If this reversal of logic hit hard for you, leave a comment at the end. This makes sense to me, because it's right here that the conversation starts to deepen, and some choices begin to be seen in a completely different light. And after all of this, there's a simple but deeply uncomfortable exercise that almost no one truly does. It's not about exact numbers or spreadsheets. It's a mental question. almost a quiet one, that reveals far more than any quick calculation ever could. If that car simply disappeared from your life today, what would actually remain of your financial life? Not what would show up on the feed, but what would still be standing when no one was watching. At first, there might be a strange sense of relief, or fear, or an emptiness that's hard to name, because when the symbol leaves the scene, reality shows up unfiltered. How much of your income would really be free? How much space would open up for choices that feel impossible right now? How many decisions would you make differently if you didn't have to maintain any narrative at all? These questions aren't theoretical. They expose behind-the-scenes truths that are usually hidden behind appearances. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because this isn't just about available money, it's about identity. Who would you be if you didn't need to prove anything? If you didn't have to confirm month after month that you're in the game, that you're moving forward, that you're keeping up with the visual pace around you? When the car stops being the reference point, what remains is something far more delicate. The relationship you've built with your own sense of worth, with success, with progress. A lot of people realize at this stage that much of the tension they carry doesn't come from a lack of money, but from the constant obligation to look like they're doing well. And when that obligation drops, even if only in thought, a rare possibility for change appears. Your mindset begins to shift because decisions stop being reactive. They become chosen, not imposed. The impact isn't immediate, but it's deep. This kind of reflection usually opens up other questions that weren't on the radar before. About income, about lifestyle, about choices made long before the car even existed. Because when you look at it honestly, this story doesn't start with the vehicle, the financing, or the monthly payment. It starts earlier, in something more subtle, something that shapes expectations, creates illusions of comfort, and defines what feels like enough. When you reach this point, you realize the car was just a visible symptom of an older pattern, and it's exactly here that the conversation gains another layer. When the display window loses its power, space opens up to look at the foundation, to understand why certain incomes look good on paper but never bring real peace of mind, why some gains feel like progress but don't build freedom. These realizations don't arrive all at once. They accumulate, asking for a closer, more honest, more personal look at your own journey. If this question is still echoing inside you, write in the comments. This makes sense to me, because once this reflection begins, it rarely stops at the car. It goes much further. And if you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation stayed with you. Maybe not as a ready-made answer, but as the kind of meaningful discomfort that helps you look at your own decisions more clearly. If this exchange resonated with you, if you felt like this message spoke directly to your reality, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." It's a simple way to show up, to mark that you were here until the end, and to keep this conversation alive among people who are also trying to better understand their own journey. If at any point you thought, finally someone put this into words, a like helps more than it seems. It signals that this kind of content deserves space, that deeper reflections about money, mindset, and choices still matter in an environment so full of noise. It's a small gesture, but one that supports this kind of dialogue. And if you feel drawn to keep exploring these layers, subscribing to the channel is just a natural way to continue the conversation, not as a commitment, but as companionship. The idea here is to keep looking at what usually stays behind the scenes, calmly, without magic formulas, but with more honesty. There's a video right here that complements this topic and goes even deeper into this reflection. Click and continue with me over there. The journey doesn't end here, it just shifts to another layer.